Well, I saw an article in the Gramophone, and it was basically a very short article, a paragraph or two, about the existence of sketches for a last sonata, his fourth sonata, and I never knew of the fourth sonata at all, and it's in the same key as the third sonata, which is in F minor. And so I looked it up and was able to find the sketches in a library in America, and they sent me some photocopies of the manuscripts. And then I got to work on them by practicing them, deciphering them first of all, of course, writing them out, practicing them so that I understood them fully and could memorize them, and then the serious work of reconstruction began. Well, I thought I'd go for the easiest, which was the last movement, because there was quite a substantial amount of material there. There were 4 sketches and in total 166 bars, whereas the first movement just had 66 bars. So I thought, yes, best place to start is where I've got most help from, the original source. And so it took me maybe 3 months, 4 months to decipher and practice them, and just understand them and exactly how it was all put together. I think that's part of the process of practicing anyway. And then got to work on just the last movement. I thought the amount of material in the first movement was only just sufficient to complete, bearing in mind that I would have to take the approach of, say, a Liszt Hungarian Rhapsody. The performer is allowed to extemporize within the realms of the Rhapsody, but less to do with the bravura, more to do with the structure and with the authenticity of the style and the harmonic structure of the whole piece, and making sure that the proportions were correct and balanced, as Schumann would have wanted himself. I approached it from what I knew of Schumann, not just from the literature, the written literature about the personality, but also from the compositional standpoint, because his personality is very well and truly represented. He's such a sincere composer, one of the great romantics of the whole period, and of course I wanted to represent him as he was. So I in a way, had to get underneath his skin. The understanding of his personality is quite well documented about the bipolarity of his personality, where you have the Floristan, which is the very fiery, driven, wanted to conquer type of energetic personality, and the Eusebius side of his personality, which was very dreamy and quite soft. And actually, he is the ideal sonata composer in many ways, because of this, because you need the bipolarity of first and second subjects in a sonata. They have to contrast with each other. It's the masculine and feminine qualities of a sonata. Well, there were quite a number of sticking points because you're only given, because of the proportion of the sonata, the gaps that I had to fill in had to be more or less equal length, and also they had to, you had to modulate quite cleverly into the next section. So you had to bridge that. So you only had a certain amount of time to do that using his harmonic language and not going beyond it or not simplifying it. Schumann's harmonic language is so interesting because he never writes too many notes. It's only, there's a transparency there, yet there's a richness. There's only just enough there. He will never double notes if he doesn't need to. So unlike Brahms would enrich the whole thing from inside out, and so you would have a much thicker texture. Whereas with Schumann it was more transparent and more open. Well, some of them happen consciously and others thinking processes happen unconsciously. The unconscious ones are the most interesting and the most rewarding. But the thing about that is you want to go back and analyse what you did and why you arrived at that result. I mean, a case in point is in the last movement. There was a conscious decision to put together the opening first figuration, which is quite a robust semiquaver flurry up to the top of the piano, and use the semiquaver pattern to accompany the second theme, and putting those two together was a conscious decision that worked very well. And but there are other things that would come up that you later look back and think, oh, that little passage was there earlier on, but I wasn't aware of it. The most important part of a reconstruction is, wherever possible, quote the composer and in another key. And quote him, and Schumann would do this himself, and do it exactly if it's called for in the form. If the form says, now is the time to come back with the second subject, do it faithfully in another key, but exactly as it was earlier, as Schumann had written. So I think that gives you a lot of authenticity to start with. And not to fiddle with anything, not to introduce any new ideas, absolutely only the ideas that are there. It took me about just over 9 months to complete the two movements, and that's initially with the studying, first of all deciphering the score and the notation, because the notations had its own problems, you know, like ledger lines. Where is the note on the ledger line? Is it 2 notes higher, or is it? And so that's a little bit of a problem with Schumann, but you know exactly what he wants in the end by trying it out. And then I needed to practice it, to actually work it into my mind and into my fingers and memorize it. Had I have started earlier, I would have gone up avenues that I would have regretted and would have had to have stripped it back to recompose. Beethoven often did work like this. He would compose up to a certain point and then strip it back and then compose and take the correct path, or he would compose by modifying it there are stages of modification, so it was like a metamorphosis, so that he could then get to the idea that he wanted in the end. Schumann was quite different. He knew exactly what he wanted, and there's very, very little crossing out. But when he got to the end of the sketch, you could almost feel his frustration. I think he would spend no more than 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and if he didn't know how he could continue, he would jump to the next sketch and then find the bridge, because he was a great composer for modulation. He could get from one key to another quite easily in the time needed. He would then cut and paste. I almost feel that what I'm doing is cutting and pasting and finding the right connections that get me to the next passage in his style, and using the material there. Both the first and the last movements are in sonata form, so that was quite clear to see from the sketches, and so that was the first most important discovery, was what was the form. That's the structural element, and that's very important indeed to analyse that. And the Fourth Sonata really came out of the Third Sonata. It had no relationship as such. The themes were quite different, but it came out, I call it the sister sonata. The Fourth Sonata is the sister sonata to the Third Sonata, which is the brother. And the brother is very fully fledged and a very robust, dramatic, fantastic piece of composition. One of the most difficult in Schumann's repertoire is the Third Sonata, and he continued his creative process in the same key to create this Fourth Sonata, but it didn't actually quite come to birth, so to speak. I was the midwife, and so there were these problems. And the problems that I had in finding the second and third movement is I found two original movements which were written in that 18-month period where he wrote three sonatas and the Schumann Fantasy, which is like a sonata. There was a whole 18-month period. And this Fourth Sonata actually belongs to this year and a half of intense composition, just purely on piano sonatas. He did this intentionally. He could, and they're all very different. The first one is less on structure, more on flamboyance, and there is an improvised quality to it, and fantasy, flight of fantasy. The second is very, very strongly structured. It's graphically done, and quite concise. The Third Sonata is kind of a combination of the first and second. It has the freedom, but it does have the structure, and a very robust piece. The Fourth Sonata is, as I said, came out of the Third Sonata, and what I've done is I've kept originally the Third Sonata had 5 movements, and he discarded one of the scherzos. There were 2 scherzos, and I've used that scherzo in the Fourth Sonata scheme as a second movement. And there was also another discard from the Third Sonata, and that is he wrote a theme well, it was actually Clara Schumann's theme, and he wrote 6 variations. But to make it more concise, he decided to exclude 2 of the variations so as to tighten up the variation structure. Not to throw them away, I've kept them. I've prefixed it by the Clara Schumann's theme, and I've kept the 2 variations that were not needed in the 3rd sonata. And that is my 3rd movement, and the 4th movement is this presto movement, which is a little bit of a sonata fantasy. It does have, he indicates 5 movement changes by hand. He writes various movement changes, and so there is a difficulty there in structuring it because of the variation in tempi. So that is one of the difficulties, but there is this freedom within the sonata, so that's why it has this sonata fantasy quality about it. But I try and keep it as concise and as structured as possible. One of his inspirations for writing the 4th sonata was the Brahms sonata, his 3rd sonata, and Brahms went to Schumann as a young man with the manuscripts tucked under his arm, and he said, and he introduced himself, a letter of introduction, and he said, I brought my 3rd sonata and like to play it to you. And so he sat down and started, and after a page, Schumann jumped up and shouted out to Clara, who was somewhere else in the house, and Brahms thought, oh, he doesn't like it. You know, he stopped playing and he doesn't like it. And moments later, Clara arrived, and Schumann asked him to begin again. And it was his introduction to this huge, big piece. The piano was fundamental to Schumann's composition. All his first 27 opuses are written for the piano. That's quite a substantial amount. And later he would, in the sonatas, he and of which there are 3, and this is the 4th one, which is incomplete, which I've completed. And also the fantasy, all those were written in this 18-month period, and the 4th sonata was written in February 1837. The 4th sonata was written in 1847, February 1847, and he honed his skills with the sonatas by keeping them together in that time frame, so as just to concentrate purely on piano sonatas. And then later, for example, before he married Clara, and when he was very much in love with Clara, and up to their marriage, he would write love songs for a year or 2. And then once married, he would write 2 symphonies, the C major the first and the B flat, the B flat the first and the C major the second. And this was his jubilation. This was a way of expressing his joy at being married. And then a year later, it came down to chamber music, quartets. So he already reduced the medium of composition, which I find quite biographical, really, and his state of mind over those 3 or 4 year period when he was about to get married and married. So that's an interesting approach to composition, and one lots of composers took. They would do things in six, in a number six. Telemann would do things in six. Handel would, Bach would, Mozart, Haydn, of course, quartets, a group of six, sometimes three, occasionally. And the quartets dedicated to Haydn, there are six of them by Mozart. And so it's interesting that they kept them, and he covered all sorts of compositional mediums that one wouldn't expect. So he was quite a prolific composer.